Karl Marx und the Freedom of the Individual, ja, by Thomas Sowell, published in the journal Ethics, volume 73, number 2, in January of 1963. Once again, this is a discussion paper called Karl Marx and the Freedom of the Individual by the economist Thomas Sowell. Section 1. Dictatorship of the Proletariat. A recurrent but vaguely defined concept in Marx is the post-revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat, which he envisioned. This phrase is often interpreted in the light of 20th century dictatorships, and particularly Soviet Russia. But to understand what Marx himself may have had in mind, the model must be sought elsewhere. Engels declared, quote, "Look at the Paris Commune. That was the dictatorship of the proletariat." End of quote. What is relevant here, of course, is not the historical Paris Commune, but the Paris Commune as seen by Marx. The specific features of the Commune which caused Marx and Engels to regard it as the political prototype of the dictatorship of the proletariat were 1. Universal suffrage, 2. Criticism of the government by the people, 3. Freedom of religion and separation of church and state, and 4. A non-militaristic outlook. In short, the common denominators of Western democracy in the current day, as of the writing of this paper in 1963. Marx was by no means an enemy of the open society. His belief in free scientific inquiry and his opposition to any governmental control of the content of education showed an attitude very different from that which has led to state attempts to mold a Soviet man. Marx sharply opposed any idea of the state as a children's home, or of society as a crowd of adults whose destiny is to be educated from above. End of quote. In the light of contemporary political concerns, there is a strange ring to Engels' statement that the democratic republic is the specific form for the dictatorship of the proletariat. End of quote. But this only indicates the pitfalls involved in reading present-day issues and problems back into earlier thinkers. For Marx, the concept of dictatorship did not at all revolve around questions of civil liberties, one-party rule, etc., but around the question of de facto control of the institutions of society. Marx saw contemporary institutions as dominated by capitalists through intellectual ideological influence as well as economic power. He assumed that the next phase of history would see similar domination by the working class. The Marxian concept of dictatorship of the proletariat expressed little more than the truism that a cohesive popular will would be overwhelming in a truly democratic state. The Paris Commune was significant in Marx's view for its enhancement of political democracy, since the political rule of the worker cannot coexist with the perpetuation of his social slavery. End of quote. The particular social welfare measures of the short-lived commune could but betoken the tendency of a government of the people by the people. End of quote. Political freedom and democracy received remarkably little attention in the writings of Karl Marx, and nowhere a systematic discussion. Yet, wherever he mentioned the subject at all, whether in his early writings of the 1840s or in his final works in the 1870s, his acceptance of democracy was unequivocal and largely uncritical. He showed no reservations, as, for example, John Stuart Mill had, over the tendency of a majority to tyrannize over individuals, or to hamstring specialists by the political weight of their collective ignorance. There were two principal reasons why democracy should tend to recede into the background of Marx's writings. First, the polemical nature of those writings, and second, Marx's preoccupation with the socio-economic rather than the political aspects of capitalism and of the society which he envisioned for the future. Almost everything from the pen of Karl Marx was polemical. He wrote nothing that simply set forth his own views systematically. One consequence of this was that his differences with his opponents largely determined the subject matter and emphasis of his writings. His principal opponents were 19th century liberals, non-Marxian socialists, and the anarchists, none of whom were authoritarians who would call forth reaffirmations of democratic principles on his part. As a brief aside from me, the narrator, 19th century liberals refers to what we would now call classical liberals or libertarians. Continuing on. While there were many economic differences on which to attack 19th century liberals, on political issues, Marx tended to skirt what has been aptly called an inconveniently large expanse of common ground. A similar situation existed with respect to other socialists, most of whom were also Democrats. They too believed in doing things in the usual democratic way, as Engels said. Usual in the sense of being a common feature of socialist theories rather than a common fact of contemporary life. Against anarchists, Marx and Engels were in the position of defending the authority of the majority over the minority. End of quote. Marxian passages defending the use of state power against individuals in this connection were later avidly quoted by Lenin in defense of an autocratic power which Marx had not contemplated. More fundamental, perhaps, than the polemical situation was Marx's emphasis on socio-economic reconstruction and his skepticism as to what political freedom alone would mean. He had no patience with those who confused political emancipation with human emancipation. End of quote. The Marxian stress was not on ideal rights, but on material means. When a man is free, in the materialist sense, according to Marx, he is free not through the negative power to avoid this or that, but through the positive power to assert his true individuality. End of quote. Thus, each man must be given social scope for the vital manifestation of his being. End of quote. Marx saw this sort of freedom as requiring society at large to consciously reorganize its social and economic life, not primarily with a view to greater economic efficiency, but in order to promote the personal development of each individual. This did not mean societies attempting to mold the individual to some preconceived pattern of virtues, but rather societies providing the circumstantial preconditions for the individual to realize himself. Here as elsewhere, Marx depicted his society of the future in a few bold strokes without details and without analysis of the obstacles in the nature of man, which stood in the way of its realization. The self-realization of the individual was the highest goal of Marxian socialism. The masses or the working class were to be the instrumentality of the envisioned revolutionary change, but it was the individual as such who was to be liberated in the post-revolutionary scheme of things. The abolition of classes was not to be for the purpose of making all men uniform atoms in society, not to destroy variation, but to make the individual rather than the class the unit of variation. Here again, Marx's thinking was sharply at variance with that of such writers as John Stuart Mill, who regarded the passing of class distinctions as the passing of distinctions generally, as the growth of uniformity. With Marx, on the contrary, it is the existence of classes which promotes uniformity and suppresses individuality within each class, and therefore, in a society composed of classes, throughout society. In a class society, Marx declared the significant social relationships in which individuals participate. They participate not as individuals, but as members of a class. End of quote. In the society Marx envisioned, it is as individuals that the individuals participate. End of quote. The Marxian aim was the liberation of each single individual, the creation of a society in which the full and free development of every individual forms the ruling principle. End of quote. These points need special emphasis in view of the idea promoted by the USSR and repeated by its friends and foes alike that there is something Marxian about sacrificing the individual to the needs of mass production. Section 2. Free will in history. It is sometimes argued that Marx denied the freedom of the individual, if not in the political sense, than in the sense of a free will. According to this view, Marxist theory of history is one of economic determinism, in which each individual is only the tool of economic forces, with the individual's own motivation being mainly economic. This image of man is said to explain the manipulative totalitarianism of contemporary Marxism. Actually, Marxist theory of history never pretended to determine, economically or otherwise, what individuals would do. The greatest latitude was allowed for the variety of personal motivation. Marxist theory denies precisely the claim that individuals, great men, that is, shape history. Hence, it does not find it necessary to go into their motives. For what each individual wills is obstructed by everyone else, and what emerges is something that no one willed. End of quote. The Marxian theory of history attempted to analyze the logic of the situation rather than determine the intentions of individuals. This has been obscured in part by the title materialist theory of history, which has sometimes been taken to mean that Marx assumed people to be materialistic in the popular sense of being avaricious, but Marxian materialism was philosophic materialism, largely of the 18th century variety, represented by Helvetius and Holbach, and has no connection with avariciousness. The economic element in the Marxian theory is somewhat peculiarly defined. What Marx called the economic structure of society does not refer to the interrelations among things, such as manufacturing, mining, transportation, etc., but to the interrelations among men, the hypothetical table of organization of society at large. It is the nature of these human relationships in production which form the real foundation on which rise legal and political superstructures, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. End of quote. The human relations are reorganized with technological change, creating new problems and the possibility of new solutions. In Marxist theory, there's no question of the weight of the economic factor vis-a-vis the weight of the psychological, biological factors, etc. It is only a question of the element making for change. For example, it might be argued that the existence of family units is better explained by biological or psychological factors than by economic factors, but that is not the question to which the Marxian theory addresses itself. It seeks to explain the changes which the family unit has undergone in different epochs, and it finds the answer in the impact of changing economic circumstances and the changed social structure. The materialist theory of history attempts to explain how the existing totality of institutions, ideas, social arrangements, etc., developed from the previously existing totality. It does not attempt to explain the complete question of their existence, for example, why there are families at all, by assigning weights to economic, psychological, biological factors, etc. Still less is the Marxian theory one of economic motivation predominating to the inclusion of any sincere idealism. On the contrary, it pictures the socio-economic changes as creating new problems and possibilities to which different groups react differently according to whether their objective positions in the economic complex cause them to perceive more the positive or the negative aspects of new economic forces, and therefore cause them to take different views of the abstract rightness or wrongness of various alternatives. According to Marx, each class attempts, from its own special point of view, to emancipate society. End of quote. Clearly, this is not a denial of idealism, but an attempt to represent the particular form this idealism will take as a function of social variables. Marx said that one must not form the narrow-minded notion that the petty bourgeoisie, on principle, wishes to enforce an egoistic class interest. End of quote. While Marx was prone to see social bias everywhere, especially in opposition to his own ideas, he never went as far as Lenin did in asserting that there can be no impartial social science. under capitalism. Marx's extensive and even Picayune criticism of Ricardian economics, for example, never descended to the level of claiming that Ricardo was activated by bias as a rich stockbroker, but criticized instead the, quote, scientific inadequacy of his methodology. Similarly, Marx declared that it would be very wrong to class such men as John Stuart Mill among the economic apologists. Individuals were not for Marx mere creatures of social circumstances, though classes as a whole were largely considered to be so. Part 3. Russia, Marx, and Democracy. While Engels suggested the Paris Commune as a model of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the Soviet Union has assumed that role for many. Its national peculiarities and paradoxes have been widely accepted as examples of the Marxian word made flesh. Thus, if the USSR lacks political liberties, this has been regarded as evidence that Marxian thought is undemocratic. If Russia concentrates on heavy industry at the expense of consumer goods, this becomes a Marxist notion, despite Marx's complete silence on this subject. If the Soviets violate international agreements, this is explained by the Marxist precept that the end justifies the means, precept not to be found in all Marx's voluminous writings. Moreover, these hasty assertions are often cited as examples of the influence of ideas on history, and therefore a further point scored against Marx. You can't have it both ways, people. But there is little need to resort to Marxian doctrine to explain Soviet practices. There is nothing mysterious in the fact that a country which has never had a tradition of individual freedom still does not have one. It's just a trend that has continued going unabated. Instead of this situation being a result of Marxian theories, Marxian theory was itself changed to accommodate the situation. The principles of the one-party state and of iron discipline in the party were included by Stalin among the new contributions made by Lenin to developing Marxist doctrine. End of quote. But far from being a development of Marx's ideas, these principles were a resurrection of the Blanquist theories which Marx and Engels had fought in their own time. Engels' description of the Blanquists was an unconscious preview of the Bolsheviks. Quote, brought up in the school of conspiracy and held together by the strict discipline which went with it, they started out from the viewpoint that a relatively small number of resolute, well-organized men would be able, at the given favorable moment, not only to seize the helm of the state, but also by a display of ruthless energy, to maintain power until they succeeded in sweeping the mass of the people into the revolution and ranging them around the small band of leaders. This involved, above all, the strictest dictatorial centralization of all power in the hands of the new revolutionary government. End of quote. For Marx, there was a fundamental difference between a secret political society and a genuine workers' organization. End of quote. Engels pointed out that the Communist League, for which he and Marx wrote the manifesto, had been thoroughly democratic, with elective and always removable boards. This alone barred all hankering after conspiracy which requires dictatorship. End of quote. He described Blanquism as the fantasy of overturning an entire society through the actions of a small conspiracy. End of quote. In his later years, Engels saw Russia as one of the exceptional cases where it is possible for a handful of people to make a revolution and thereby give a certain justification, end of quote, to Blanquist ideas. He did not foresee that it would be called Marxism when it happened. Blanquism was basically incompatible with the Marxian view of history and of the proletariat. Marx saw the coming of communism in his special sense as the result of a long series of struggles transforming conditions and men. The kind of society he envisioned required, as Lenin observed, a person not like the present man in the street. End of quote. Marx saw this new sort of person emerging as a natural result of the sobering process of a social struggle lasting perhaps half a century. The educational role of adversity and setbacks for the proletariat was a recurrent theme in the writing of Marx and Engels. Lenin, on the other hand, believed that the proletariat would never autonomously develop the necessary outlook and purposeful unity. Class political consciousness can be brought to the working class only from without. End of quote. Whatever the relative merits in terms of realism of the Marxist versus the Leninist concept of the working class, this crucial shift of assumptions necessitated a fundamental change, however covert, in the line of march toward communism, both before and after seizure of power. Despite the points of contradiction between the original theories of Marx and the later contributions of Lenin, the undemocratic elements associated with contemporary Marxism were not due entirely to latter-day developments in Leninist theory and socialist Soviet practice. In Marx himself, there was a curious dualism between the democratic ideals of the intellectual and the ruthless will to power of the man. While the explicit Marxian precepts were democratic, Marx's own practices foreshadowed to some extent the conspiratorial repressive pattern of modern communism. Marx's consuming hatreds and ideological intolerance, his immersion in the intrigues and cutthroat power struggles of the First International, his ad hoc justifications of terrorism, and other concessions to expediency were mere faint forecasts and foretastes of Russia, the Russia of Lenin and Stalin. There was more traditional than intellectual continuity in the history of Marxism. Even on the intellectual plane, there were features of Marxian thought that lent themselves to the Leninist transformation, notably, first, the doctrine of historical justification, and second, the unshakable self-righteousness of representing the emergent proletarian outlook, which was independent of whatever outlook happened to be actually prevalent among real proletarians in the real world. Engels declared that Marxism took from Hegel the great basic thought that the world is not to be comprehended as a complex of ready-made things, but as a complex of processes. End of quote. Among the corollaries derived from this was a rejection of eternal truths and eternal values in judging either ideas or institutions. Quote, each stage is necessary and therefore justified for the time and conditions to which it owes its origin. But in the face of new, higher conditions which gradually develop in its own womb, it loses its validity and justification. End of quote. With such flexible standards, a man could remain a Marxist and at the same time be a Stalinist apologist, though it would be equally consistent for him to be a Trotskyite or a social democrat, depending on how he assessed the current stage of history. Marx himself had even justified slavery in ancient Greece, though he opposed it in 19th century America. The establishment of a proletarian government oppressing not only other classes but the workers themselves, the dictatorship over the proletariat, as it has been called, was perhaps the most grotesque contradiction between Marx's vision and what actually happened. Yet even this owes something to the original Marxian assumptions. Marx and Engels habitually spoke in the name of a proletarian ideology and unhesitatingly dismissed as bourgeois the ideas they found actually to be dominant among the workers. The same practice was followed by Lenin. Presumably the proletarian ideology spoken of represented what workers would believe in the absence of dupery, prejudice, ignorance, etc. The Marxian conviction of speaking in the real interests of the mass of humanity was too invincible to be shaken by the apathy, hostility, and even, in the 20th century, open revolt of real workers. These institutional blinders must be laid to the door of the originators of Marxian ideology. The end.